Good evening and welcome. My name is Peter Roos and I'm the Executive Director of the Mark Twain House Museum, and we are so glad that all of you came. And before I go any further, I do want to apologize that our website got hacked and it led to all sorts of problems, some of which were that we don't have enough books for all of you. You will all get your book. You will also, if you don't have a book, you will get a book plate, and if you want that signed and you want to talk to Fiona, you can go up to the front and get that signed, and when your book comes, you can put it in, and I'm sorry, it's the best we can do under the circumstances. Somebody in Asia doesn't like us, so what can I tell you? When you would Google us, an ad for Chinese t-shirts would come up, So programs at the Mark Twain House and Museum are made in part by support from Connecticut Humanities, from the Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development in their Office of the Arts, the Ensworth Charitable Foundation, Bank of America, the Greater Hartford Arts Council's United Arts Campaign, the Hartford, the Mark Twain Foundation, the National Endowment for Humanities, and the Wish You Well Foundation, as well as the Travelers. I would like to mention a couple of books that we have coming up, book talks that we have coming up, one of which is virtual, and that's Riverman on July 19th, which is an American Odyssey, kind of an interesting story. And on July 26th, we have The Scandalous Hamiltons, Gilded Age grifter and a disgraced descendant of a young founding father, and that is both in person and live stream. So we are starting to do hybrid programming where you can either come here or you can watch it online as well. In October, a little advance notice, we have Maggie Haberman talking about her book, Confidence Man, The Making of Donald Trump and the Breaking of America. And now, to the main event. New York Times best-selling author Fiona Davis, who is a wonderful individual, I can tell you, having just taken her through the house, has spent the better part of a decade mining hidden histories of iconic New York city buildings and skillfully using each setting to illuminate the experiences of women and asking questions about how women's voices have changed over time. Fiona is the New York Times best-selling author of 6 historical fiction novels set in iconic New York City buildings, including the Magnolia Palace, the Dollhouse, the Address, and the Lions of Fifth Avenue, which was also a Good Morning America book club pick. Her novels have been chosen as One Book, One Community Reads, and her articles have appeared in publications like the Wall Street Journal and the Oprah Magazine. She first came to New York as an actress, but fell in love with writing after getting a master's degree at Columbia Journalism School. Her books have been translated into over a dozen languages, and she's based in New York. And with that, I would like to welcome Fiona Davis to the stage.
Thank you everyone for coming. I'm sorry I don't have any Chinese t-shirts to give out next time. I thought what I'd do today, it's just wonderful to be here. The Mark Twain House is incredible. I just got a tour. It was amazing. And I thought what I might do today is tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to be a writer, and then dive into the backstory behind the Magnolia Palace, which is my latest book, kind of how it came to be, from the very germ of the idea to the final product. So my parents are both English, and when I was a kid, we would go back to England every 3 years to visit all the relatives. And we'd start down in the bottom near Portsmouth, go all the way up to Scotland, all the way back down in this rental car, and to keep me and my brother from killing each other in the back seat, we would stop every so often at castles and ruins and grand estates, and they let us run wild. And I loved this. I loved how old everything was. You know, anything that's less than 400 years old is pretty recent. I remember going to Chatsworth House, which was built in the 1500s and has been in the same family for 16 generations. And just walking those halls and imagining what it was like for a servant girl in the 1600s or an aristocrat in the 1800s just really fired up my imagination. So it's no surprise when I started writing books, I ended up setting each one in an iconic New York City building, basically because it gives me the opportunity to snoop around. But I didn't start writing. I couldn't ever imagine writing a book when I was in my 20s, 30s, and early 40s. I didn't publish my book until I was 49, my first book. And I did a lot of other things. So I came to New York as an actress, and I worked on Broadway, off Broadway. I'm 5'10", so I was in a lot of productions of Three Tall Women. I worked with a theater company, and we ended up, doing about 3 shows a year, and we'd do everything. We'd hang the lights, we'd sweep the stage, right? We'd sell the tickets. One of our plays went from off Broadway to Broadway and was nominated for a Tony Award. And so it was really this incredible time in my 20s of this collaboration and learning to work with other people and just learning to create art. And then as I got into my late 20s, early 30s, I started looking at my friends who were women who were actresses. And they were a little older, and the jobs were really drying up. And then my male friends who were actors were aging into these fabulous character roles. And this was in the 90s. And I started thinking, well, that's not fair. Maybe there's something else I want to do. And so I applied to Columbia Journalism School, and I got in. And that, again, was this incredible experience of learning how to write, learning how to shape a story, learning, how to interview someone who I'd never met. And I ended up doing my thesis there on the shelf life of a New York actress, which was a lot of fun. So kind of bringing everything together. And at that point, I think there's some water up here, let me grab it. At that point, I started freelancing. I was writing articles for Oprah and Women's Health. So if you needed, a 700-word article on heartburn, I was your girl. It was interesting, but there was something just not quite fulfilling about it. And at one point, I remember I was looking for a new apartment in New York City. And my broker took me to the Barbizon 63 condo. Now, I knew that had been the Barbizon Hotel for women, but I didn't know much more than that. I knew it was a place where cultured young ladies would come to New York and stay while they lived or studied. That was the home of the Ford models, and a lot of the Katie Gibbs Secretarial School girls would stay there. And I got this, wonderful tour of this apartment, which I didn't end up buying. But at that point, I learned something really interesting. I learned that when the building went condo in 2005, there were a dozen of the old-time residents still living there. And they'd been there for decades. And at that time, they were moved into these rent-controlled apartments on the 4th floor. Meanwhile, they built these luxury condos around them. And I was just so curious. My journalist mind started thinking, well, what happens when the guy who bought the $17 million penthouse takes the elevator down and it opens up on the 4th floor, and one of these ladies who feels like they own the building, who are paying $250 a month in rent, and they stumble on. And I started thinking this would be a great article because it would show how the building and the residents and the city has changed over time. But at that time, I was having a very hard time getting the ladies to be interviewed. They were very private. And I thought, okay, that's not gonna work. But I couldn't shake it. And I started thinking, okay, what if I wrote a book? And then I could make stuff up. Which as a journalist was really terrifying to think of making up dialogue. But I started taking some workshops and classes, and it became kind of my hobby. And I started working on this story, and that became my first book, The Dollhouse. And like I said, it was published when I was 49. I highly recommend changing your career every 10 years. It seems to do the trick. And now I'm doing something that I absolutely love, and that really kind of meshes all of my interests together. So each building that I choose kind of comes about in a different way. That's how the first one, The Dollhouse, came about. The second one was set at the Dakota. And that happened because I was walking by it one morning and I was thinking about, okay, where else do I want to set a book? And the sun was hitting the Dakota, and like it was shining, like it was glowing, like it was saying, pick me. And I thought, okay, but I had a huge problem. I'd never been inside, and I didn't know anyone who lived there. And it's not a building that you can walk up and say, hey, give me a tour. They don't like that. And so what happened was a friend of mine who's a real estate broker said, you know, Lauren Bacall's apartment is on the market for $23 million. Let's go. So I threw a scarf around my neck, and I got my most fabulous purse, and we got this incredible tour of Lauren Bacall's apartment. It was an estate sale. She died about 3 years earlier, but a lot of the original detail was there. And so I was wandering around and getting this tour and looking at everything, trying to memorize the fireplace, the molding, what was the floor like, what was the dining room like, while asking very dumb questions like, is there a gym? I'm sure she thought I was mad. And later I did get to know a couple people in the building and got a full tour from the basement, where there's a room full of claw-footed bathtubs because you're not allowed to throw anything out. Because at one point there was a resident living there who decided to strip everything from her apartment and put in floor-to-ceiling mirrors and shag carpets. And I won't tell you who it was, but Roberta Flack. Much to the co-op board's chagrin. And so they instituted this thing where if you change anything, it goes down in the basement. So there's these rooms full of pocket doors and bathtubs. And you know, I went up to the very top floor where the maids would live. And that became my second book, The Address. And at that point, I was off and running. And for this book, The Magnolia Palace, it's set at the Frick collection, which I see a lot of people nodding. It's a gem of a museum. If you ask any New Yorker what their favorite museum is, they tend to say the Frick. It's not like the Met or the Guggenheim, which are very big and kind of daunting. The Frick was the home of the Frick family for many years before it became a museum. And as you walk in, it's really frozen in time. So it's almost as if the Frick family went off to a dinner party and they'll be back at any moment. And I thought, okay, this could work, especially because what I love is dual timeline novels with an element of mystery that really drives the story forward. I love a good plot twist. And so the Frick I thought might work because it was a residence, and then it became a museum. So the first thing I did was I reached out and I asked for a tour. And they were lovely. They were so welcoming. And I showed up. See if that works. A second. There we go. There's the Frick. So as you can see, it's beautiful. It's kind of set back from Fifth Avenue. It's not so imposing. Those are two of the 3 magnolia trees that are on the front lawn. And it's a really, really beautiful building. And they brought me inside, and I was able to get this lovely tour. So here's the entranceway. And tucked behind that niche, behind that grandfather clock, is a huge organ. You can see the pipes just beyond it, because Mr. Frick liked to have organ music as they ate their meals. And they had an organist on staff who would play for them. And as you walk through, you can see, here's the living hall, which is really quite beautiful. You can see how it's preserved as well, that it's very much just like the Fricks were just there. Here you have the Fragonard room, which has these beautiful panels that were built for a mistress of Louis XIV, and she declined them, believe it or not. But they're called The Progress of Love, and they tell the tale of a courtship from beginning to end. And they're really quite beautiful. Now the Frick, I have to tell you, is closed for renovation. It seems whatever building I do, I shut it down. I know, I did the New York Public Library, and that came out in 2020, so we couldn't have any events there because of course it was closed. And this one is closed for renovation for a couple years, but a lot of the art has been moved to the Frick Madison, which is just a few blocks away. And it's really a beautiful setting to be able to see the artwork and really step back, because as you can see in the house, everything is quite in front of you. And so I highly recommend checking out the Frick Madison if you have a moment. And one of the things we did as we did this tour was they took me not only to the public rooms, but also down to the basement where the kitchen was, and that's where the male staffers slept. There's also a bowling alley that was built there in 1914 that still works. And so I knew I had to set a scene down there. And then, oops. And then here is the art gallery, because Mr. Frick loved his art. Now, in a normal Gilded Age house, this would be a ballroom. But because he was an art collector, it became a beautiful place for his art collection to be assembled. And apparently he used to go in there late at night when it was dark and just sit in the dark and look at his paintings. And so then we also went up to the second floor, and that's where the Frick's bedrooms were and any guest bedrooms. And then up to the very top floor, and that was where the maids slept. And there's a fur vault, as one has, and a trunk storage room. And you could really see, even though a lot of it had been moved in, changed over into offices and storage as a museum, you could really get a sense of what the place was like when there were servants there running the place and when the family were there. And as you walk around, you have the sunlight streaming through the windows. You have these beautiful furnishings and rugs, but in every room and in every hallway, the artwork takes precedence. They have Renoirs, Bellinis, Degas. There are 34 Vermeers in the world, and 3 are at the Frick. He loved his art. And so it's really, really beautiful. When Mr. Frick built this mansion in 1914, it cost $5 million to build. That would be the equivalent of $80 million today. And when he died in 1919, only 5 years later, the art on the walls was worth $40 million. It was quite a collection. So now that I knew I really wanted to set a book here, I had to learn more about the Fricks. And I didn't really know much. And Henry Clay Frick, I learned, was born in Pennsylvania in coal country in 1849. His first job was as a bookkeeper for a distillery. And he understood the importance of steel, which of course at that time was very much in demand. And he created a company that produces coke. And that's not the drug or the soda. That is a fuel that's used to make steel. And so he started this coke company. He made his first million by the age of 30. And he went and he married a woman named Adelaide Howard Childs, and here she is on her wedding day. And they settled in Pittsburgh in a very beautiful house there. And that's where he started painting, or started collecting art. He bought his first Vermeer in 1899, his first Renoir in, I think, 1901. And he was just set on this. This was his joy, his passion. And at some point, he decided that they should move to New York. And he hired the firm Carrere and Hastings, who also designed the New York Public Library, by the way, to build this house. And what he asked for, he wanted a house that was simple and conservative in every way. Now, really. But when you compare it to some of the Gilded Age houses, right, like the Vanderbilts, who basically plopped a French chateau on Fifth Avenue, in contrast, this house, which was set off from the street, it's Indiana limestone, it's only 3 stories tall. It really was pretty simple, just in comparison. And they moved in there in 1914. So we have this family when they moved in, they had, he moved in, that's actually his daughter, Helen Frick. She was 30 when they moved in, or in her mid-20s when they first moved in. In the book, she's around 30. And so he lived there with Helen, his adult daughter, and his wife, Adelaide. They also had a son, Childs, but he lived in Long Island with his family. And so it was a family of 3, served by a staff of 27, as one has. They had, a vegetable cook, they had an organist, they had a butler, they had a night watchman. It really was this, like a city that they created. And these 3 family members were very interesting because they were all very much haunted by a tragedy that happened to the Frick family earlier, where the adult sister to Helen, the sister to Helen, who was just a couple years older, her name was Martha, died very tragically when she was around 5. And it was a very terrible death. You can read about it in the book. And it really scarred the family. It really destroyed Adelaide in many ways. And she retreated from view, the mom, and she pulled back. She became very depressed. And so Helen stepped up to be her father's confidant, both socially and in terms of the art collecting. Now, these were two really hard-headed people. Mr. Frick was a ruthless businessman. Make no bones about that. He was not well-liked for good reason. And Helen was also she was very much a daddy's girl, but very temperamental. And I can only imagine the fights that went on in that house, and I went ahead and did. They were very interesting. And so what happened was Mr. Frick died in 1919. And at that point, Helen was left $38 million. It made her the richest unmarried woman in America. Childs was not left as much, and that became a real rift between the two. You can read about that in the book as well. And what happened was, after he died, Helen and Adelaide stayed on at the house until Adelaide passed away in 1931. And then at that point, the house was turned over to become a museum, which was Mr. Frick's intention all along. That's what he wanted to do with his property and with his artwork. And so Helen bought a farm up in Bedford, and she settled up there. And meanwhile, the house was converted to a museum, and that opened in 1935. Now, Helen was a really interesting woman. Here's a great photo of her. Here she is. So Helen was quite fascinating. I found a 1939 New Yorker article about her, a profile, that described her as a woman of extremely robust prejudices. She was very opinionated and strong-willed. So say in the 1920s, having bobbed hair was very popular, but if any of her friends bobbed their hair, she dropped them. She basically wore her hair in a pompadour and a bun most of her entire life. She also hated Germans. She wouldn't allow, she created this library, an art reference library next door to the Frick, and she wouldn't allow anyone with a German last name entrance. She wouldn't allow them to work on the staff. On her farm, she wouldn't allow any equipment that was German, nor could anyone with a German last name be allowed inside. She was very, very opinionated about that. She also was on the board of the Frick, and she fought with the other board members quite a bit until she finally resigned in a huff in the 1960s. She loved her dogs, she loved her nieces and nephews, but she just was a very temperamental woman in many ways. At the same time, she was this mix of contradictions, because when she was younger, she created a home, a vacation home for factory girls up in Massachusetts. So these girls who worked so hard could have a place where they could go and rest and relax for a week or two. She also, during World War I, created a Red Cross unit and traveled with it to to France, where they kind of helped with the French refugees and the refugee situation there. And it was a really traumatic experience for her. She was very much scarred by it, to the point where she was kind of shell-shocked, where she came home and her father wrote a letter that explained that Helen could no longer walk straight through Grand Central Concourse. She had to stick to the perimeter, because otherwise she might faint. And this explains her hatred of Germans in many ways. She also never married, never had kids, but she put all of her passion into this Frick Art Reference Library, which is right next door to the Frick building. It's one of the top art reference libraries today, and it's a really outstanding building and an organization. That was her baby. That's what she did. And so I started, as I was leaving the Frick, I started thinking, okay, Helen needs to be a player here, because she is a strong woman and very three-dimensional. And so I thought I'd include her as well. And as I was leaving, I looked above the doorway, and there was this woman carved in stone. And I learned that her name was Audrey Munson, and boy, did I go down a rabbit hole here. Audrey Munson was considered the supermodel of the early 1900s because she had perfect neoclassical features. She had a long nose, a small chin, big eyes, long hair. She had narrow shoulders but very curvy hips. She was well known for the dimples on her lower back. And she became very, very popular with the sculptors of the era and became a muse to many of them. and found great, great success to the point that she can be found all over Manhattan even today. If you walk down a Manhattan street, you may pass an Audrey Munson. For example, there's 3 of her at Columbus Circle. She's at the Brooklyn Museum. She rises above the fountain at the Plaza Hotel, right across the street from it, which I'm sure you're familiar with. She's there at the New York Public Library, the Firemen's Memorial on the Upper West Side, the New York Municipal Building downtown. And this one's my favorite. This is the Titanic Memorial, which is on the Upper West Side, and it's called Memory. And I just think that's such an exquisite picture of her. And she had this amazing life, right? She had this great success, but then she got caught up in a terrible scandal. What happened was her landlord killed his wife very violently. And the police, when they were investigating it, found a black and white photo of Audrey Munson in a bathing suit from an ad that she'd done. And they decided it must be a love triangle. And they really started hounding her, to the point where her and her mother escaped to upstate New York to get away from it. And then things just really went downhill. She tried to get into silent films. That did not work. Eventually, she tried to die by suicide by drinking mercury. And finally, her mother had to put her in an asylum, where she died, get this, in 1996, at the age of 104. And at that time, she was buried in an unmarked grave. And I just thought, here's this woman who we see everywhere in New York, and she's been lost to history. And I started thinking, same with Helen, right? Both these women are overshadowed by the men in their lives. Audrey by the sculptors, and Helen by her father. And so I started thinking, what if these two met? There's no sign that they ever did, but they are connected by the mansion. And what if this wild child artist's muse met the very prickly Helen Frick? What would happen? And so as I was leaving my tour, this kind of scene popped into my head. And it was, what if there's Audrey? And in the book, I call her Lillian because she's inspired by Audrey Munson, but I changed the trajectory of her life, so I haven't given away any spoilers. And so in the book, Lillian is standing outside the mansion looking up at the carving of herself. And this is at the height of the scandal, and she doesn't know what's going to become of her. And what if the door opened and a woman said, "Hurry up, get inside, you're late"? And what if she went inside and realized that she'd been mistaken for an applicant for the private secretary to Helen Frick? Then I thought, what if she got the job? Because this would give her a perfect excuse to kind of hide out. And they both love art, which is something they have in common. And so that was the first kind of germ of the idea that came to me. And at that point, I knew it was time to really start doing some research, which is a really fun part of doing the job. And so luckily the Frick archives are incredible. They have this incredible digital archive where I could see photos of the rooms that had been turned into storage and offices. So I could see the bedrooms, I could see what they were like back then. They had a staff, a payroll, so I could see all 27 employees, who they were, what they did, what they got paid, what their nationality was. And so I could kind of start to flesh out the house and the inhabitants within it. They also had things like dinner party menus from 1915. So I could see, all right, 30 people were invited, here's who they were, here's the 7 courses that they were fed. And that's so helpful writing historical fiction, because it's that kind of detail that you want to get in there, right? Because it really just brings it to life. There were also some wonderful biographies you can see there, written by a descendant of the Frick family. One on Henry, one on Helen, that were really valuable. I found a 1905 book on how to be a private secretary, which was quite helpful. And I talked to architectural experts and art historians and experts in whatever field I could find that applied to the book, just to kind of figure out how to create a story around this. And so from there, I decided to set the book in 2 different years. In 1919, it's from the point of view of this artist model, who we call Lillian, and she's hired to be the private secretary to Helen Frick, partly as a way to hide out from this scandal. And she becomes very embroiled in the family drama, and there's lots of it. and it includes romantic trysts as well as a stolen pink diamond that I call the Magnolia diamond. Now that is made up. Don't go looking for it at the Frick. But it was something that kind of developed naturally within the story. And then the other timeline I set it in is 1966. And I did that for a couple of reasons. One, I hadn't worked in that decade before. It was new to me. And also it was when it was a museum. So I could really show how it had changed over time. And that part of the story is from the point of view of a model, a fashion model from London named Veronica. And she's been hired to come to the Frick to do a Vogue photo shoot that goes terribly wrong. She's not a very good model. And she gets trapped inside during a 3-day snowstorm, along with an artist intern named Joshua. And she stumbles upon a series of hidden messages that are tucked within the artwork on the walls of the Frick. And these lead her and Joshua on a scavenger hunt that she hopes might solve all of her financial problems, as well as possibly solve a decades-old murder in the Frick family. And so that's where kind of all of the pieces started coming together, and I had my characters, I had an idea of what I wanted the story to be, and started creating the outline so that I could start writing. Now, I wrote this book in 2020. I got the tour in January of 2020, and then of course March 2020, everything locked down. Luckily, the Frick has a lot online, including a 360-degree floor plan. So normally I would go back and make multiple visits. But in this case, as I was writing, I could jump into any room and look around and say, okay, that's above the fireplace, where's that painting? And that helped a lot. That solved so many problems. Another thing that happened after the book came out, I was being interviewed for a podcast, and the interviewer pointed out that this second timeline, which I gave myself a lot of challenges, right? I wanted a limited number of characters, a limited setting, and a limited timeline. And so it's basically 2 characters set at the Frick over 3 days. And the interviewer for this podcast said, you know, you quarantined your characters. And I thought, oh yeah, right, I did. And you know, I've lived in New York City for about 35 years now, and part of the wonderful thing about writing there is that as you move around, you know, you're always inspired. So during lockdown, it was really tough. I missed taking the bus across town and seeing someone's face and thinking, right, that's what the maid looks like. Or I miss going to theater and hearing dialogue and thinking, oh, right, that's what I'm doing wrong. I need to change it this way. And so it's really wonderful that now the city is back and up and running, and it's a big relief to have that back. But you know, what I did is I holed up and I just started writing, and that's where the book came out of. Now, one of the things in the book is the character of Joshua. As I said, I wrote this during 2020 when there was a lot going on. There was a lot of racial strife in America. And that started me wondering what's missing from the Frick's walls, and that is diverse perspectives. And so I started interviewing Black historians, Black art curators, Black art world experts to find out what their stories were like, and it was fascinating because the art world is so hard to make your way in, never mind if you're a person of color. And they talked about things like going on a tour at a big museum and never getting their question answered when they raised their hand, or going to a workshop and having the person giving the workshop ask them if they were in the right room. And it was these kind of things that started to fill out the character of Joshua, who is named after Joshua Johnson, who was considered the first recognized Black painter in America. He worked in Baltimore in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and he made his living by painting affluent whites. And so Joshua, as the character in the book, he understands the art on the walls and how it relates to art history, and also the forgotten Black artists who helped shape that art history. And so as they do this scavenger hunt, he's able to help Veronica, but he also provides a larger context for the history of art in the Frick family in general as well, and the art world in general. Now, luckily, the Frick is very committed to diversity. They have after-school programs, education programs, and they also have this amazing thing called it's a collaboration with a program in the Bronx called the Ghetto Film School. And the Ghetto Film School is high school students. They learn how to work the equipment. And then they come to the museum on the days that it's closed, and they get free run. They learn about the paintings, they learn about the art, and then they're encouraged to write short films and set them there. And they're really incredible. You can find them on the website of frick.org. And they really provide an interesting view that I think otherwise might be lost, and I highly recommend you checking them out. And so that's a little bit about me, about the book, about the process of writing. And really, this book, as well as all of them, really, it encompasses all of the things that I'm interested in. That is how women's voices have changed over time and how they haven't, the importance of the arts in our lives, and also just finding these hidden stories that are tucked beneath New York's historic timeline. Thank you. Thank you. And now I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the books, about writing in general, about anything you like, really.
Can I have the microphone just in case it needs to be passed along if anybody needs to speak louder?
Yes.
Hard to go from something so collaborative as being an actress to going something that's so singular and more of a moment to be an author?
That's a great question. Was it tough to go from being collaborative in the theater to working alone as an author? And I was always a decent actress, but I'm quite an introvert. And so I think it was a better fit to be a writer. When I had my theater company, I was in my element, and that felt safe. But going to a soap opera audition, when you're standing there and trying to look shorter than the guy, it didn't quite work. So yeah, it was definitely a transition, but I think I'm more suited to, going out and interviewing people and then coming home and writing. When I was trying to figure out what to do in that transition in my late 20s, this was in the 90s, so I decided to take a Briggs-Meyer test. And you couldn't do that online because there was no online back then. And so I went down to NYU and spent 3 hours taking this test, and it told me that I should either be a journalist or a policeman. So I chose journalist. Anyone else? Yes, in the yellow. Oh, that's a great question. The Chelsea Girls is one of my books, and it's set at the Chelsea Hotel. And it's from the point of view of an actress and a playwright who are trying to put a play on Broadway during the McCarthy era. And that was inspired very much by an actress named Virginia Robinson. She was in her late 90s when I met her, and she was a friend of a friend. She was still acting at that time. She was in Girls. She was incredible. And she had been an actress on Broadway. She was a long-term understudy. She understudied for Vivian Leigh and all, Fay Wray and all these people. And she was very active in the New York theater art world and the theater world. And as we talked, she started telling me things about, red channels and loyalty oaths. And I knew that was the McCarthy era, but I didn't really know. And she just became very angry. And she said, look it up. And of course I did. And I just learned about what happened in the New York theater world in the 50s that was so shocking to me and had repercussions that I sensed were happening today. And so it's very much inspired by Virginia. She was really incredible. She passed away right before the book came out, but she was absolutely the inspiration for it. And did you have a question right in front?
I was just going to ask you, typically, how long does it take you once you get your ideas and you research and your tours? How long does it take you then to finish your books?
Yeah, first of all, I have to say I don't have kids. And I think that makes a big difference. Yeah, it takes, the early books took about a year to write. I would do about 2 or 3 months of research, and that's heavy research, just kind of gorging on all the information I could. And then I write about 10 drafts of the book before it's ready to go to my agent and then my editor. These days, because there's more publicity, which is wonderful, and more speaking tours and that kind of thing, it takes about a year and a half. And I find I have to write them pretty quickly because you're trying to keep especially when there's 2 timelines and a mystery, you're trying to keep so much in your head. It's like a juggling act. And I worry that if I put it down for too long, I'd have to, start from the beginning. So, as you put it together, I tend to do research and then I figure out the outline and the characters. And then I very carefully braid those two timelines together. And it's around those 2 weeks that I find I'm drinking a lot of wine at midnight because it's so difficult. So I'm pretty fast. Yes, in the back there.
Do you have a dedicated space and certain hours of the day and that sort of routine?
Yeah, I have an apartment in New York City, and I have an office that I can kind of see a side view of the Hudson River, so that's where I really work. But during COVID, actually, my boyfriend who's here, who's also a writer, we decamped to our house up in Westchester, and we have a very long dining room table, and we each took an end. And it was really great, because we could write away, and if you had kind of what's that word? You could just peer over your computer and ask. So now we do a little bit of both, which works out pretty well. Right behind, and yeah.
The transition from becoming an author, how long did it take your first book to be accepted and published?
Yeah, the question was, how long did it take my first book to get published? I was very lucky. What I did was I knew no one in the fiction book world. I knew no one in the book world. And so as I started getting that manuscript into shape, I started going to workshops or to conferences, writers' conferences, and listening to learn about the industry. And I remember going to a panel of agents, and one of them talked about how she was looking for strong female characters. And I thought, okay, once it's done, I'll send it to her. And so I sent it out to an early round of agents, and she got back to me and said, I love this, and I have a title for you, but I'm not going to tell you unless you sign with me. And that was The Dollhouse, which was great. And
What did you do financially during that writing?
I was working as a journalist. So as I wrote that book, I was always working, yeah. It kind of sneaking it in between projects. Exactly. And now I write full time, which is just fiction, which is really nice. Is someone there? Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I was. Yeah, the question was, would I go outside of New York to write books? And yeah, the Isabella Gardner, I was just watching that documentary about the theft there, which could be really fun to play with. I've never been, so I would have to go and check it out. Okay. Or hey, the Mark Twain House, right? There are so many great places. I would also love to go to London and do something like at the Globe Theatre or something like that. The next book, actually, that I'm working on right now, the idea came through an email I got from my author website. And it was a woman who reached out to me, and she said, I live in North Carolina. I'm in my 80s. I'm a former Rockette. And if you want to know the secrets of Radio City, you should call me. So of course I had to. And so I'm working hard on that book now. It's set in the 1950s at Radio City. Yeah, so keep an eye out. That'll be out next summer. And in the meantime, just so you know, there's a short story coming out at the end of this month, July 28th. It's called A Wild Rose. If you have Amazon Prime, you can download it for free. And it's also will be on Audible. If you have an Audible, it's for free there. And that is set at Carnegie Hall. And that came about, I was asked to write a short story, and I'd started looking at Carnegie Hall and learned that when it was built, they included 100 or so artist studios right above it. And it's like this warren of artist studios where Mark Twain has passed through there, in fact. Marlon Brando lived there for a while. Bill Cunningham of the New York Times fame lived there. It's just full of interesting people. So that'll be coming out. It's called A Wild Rose on July 28th, so you can keep an eye out for that too. Anyone else?
So your characters are really strong, but you always are inspired by a setting. I think that's part of your theater background. Why is that? It's the building that is the title in some sense.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the journalist in me loves to have that scaffolding of reality and input. So every building I look at, I find a surprise. Like, for example, that Grand Central Terminal had an art school inside it, for 20 years. Who knew? Or that, that there's an apartment inside the New York Public Library where a family lived for 30 years. And so it's finding those surprises and then creating fictional characters and settings around them that are very much influenced by the issues of the day, whether it's the 1910s or the 1950s. I think the journalist in me needs that in order to just give a lift off for the inspiration. Great, I think we have time for one more. How are we doing? Yeah, one more question? Yes, in the back? Oh, I would love to. It has such a history. And I could, go to England and write off, right? Write off the trip. It'd be great. Yeah, that would be amazing. It would be pretty overwhelming, but I think it would be great. And you could probably have 3 storylines with all the history that's right there. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'll be signing books and book plates. Again, thank you for your patience with that. And I really look forward to talking to you more. And thank you again, Peter, for the invitation to come here. It's been a joy. And happy reading, everybody. Have a great summer.